Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to show you a game played between the women's world chess champion Wenjun and Alireza Firouzja from France. And this game is played in the round 5 of the Tata Steel Chess 2024. And without any further ado, let's get into the video. Wenjun is playing with the white pieces and she opens the game pawn to d4. Alireza plays pawn to e6. Wenjun has the option to play either c4 or convert this game into a king's pawn game ending up in a French defense and play the move e4, and she chooses to play e4 and converts this game into a French defense. Alireza plays pawn to d5 and Wenjun plays the exchange French with e takes d5 and e takes d5. The thing is, the exchange French is one of the boring variations in chess because it's very symmetrical and white plays knight f3 and black is always a tempo slow, so black has to catch up the game very soon, or else one slow move by black, white gains an advantage. So it's very symmetrical. Black can simply go knight f6, bishop to d3, maybe even bishop to d6. Black can simply repeat what white is doing and still play the game, maybe short castles. So this position is so dry. So that's the thing about the exchange French. But here Alireza plays the move bishop to d6, and Wenjun plays the move pawn to c4, trying to create some imbalances and make the position more interesting with some more life. And Alireza just plays knight to f6, allowing this move c5, which will hit his bishop and make his bishop go back. Which Wenjun plays the move c5, forcing the bishop to go back to e7. And this move takes more space in the queen side, but it is also a kind of an overextension because black is not bad, because black has this move b6, which will undermine the structure very easily. So yeah, black plays this move bishop to e7, and white plays the move bishop to d3. Black castles, white castles. Bishop to g4, pins the knight to the queen. h3 attacks the bishop and asks, "What do you want to do with the bishop?" And Alireza says, "I want to keep pinning this knight to the queen." So, in this position, Wenjun develops a strategy to place her pieces to the optimal squares by not developing her knight to c3, because it could go there, but she plays the move bishop to e3 first, and after knight to c6, she plays the move knight bd2. So this reinforces this knight so that the queen is free to move to the queen side, maybe to a4, maybe to c2, and this bishop need not be passive in order to break this pin. And white also doesn't need to commit this pawn to g4, which will be a weakening move in this position because black's pieces are so active and g4 is pretty dangerous in the positions. So she continues developing the queenside knight to the d2 square, which will support this knight on the king side. So that's why she put her knight on d2. Firouzja plays the move rook e8, and now Wenjun goes for an attack on the queen side with her bishop. But the drawback of this bishop to b5 move is it took its eye off the e4 square. This bishop, when it was on d3, it was defending the e4 square. But now the control of the e4 square is pretty much loosened. So Firouzja plays this wonderful move, knight to e4, plops his knight in the center of the board, and opts for a trade of knights. So Wenjun continues with her plan on the queen side with queen a4, bishop to b5, and putting pressure on c6 so that after bishop takes c6, this b pawn has to end up there, creating a double pawn, which could be captured by the queen later or even in the endgame. So Firouzja trades and Wenjun recaptures and bishop to g5. What beginner players will do is, okay, bishop to g5, okay, let me trade this. But trading actually helps black because black's queen enters the game with a tempo on the knight. So it just helps black. So instead of capturing what capturing this dark squared bishop, what white does is white plays this move bishop takes c6 first, and after b takes c6, now the pawn structure is damaged and these weaknesses are isolated and they cannot move anywhere because there is a pawn on c5 blockading these two pawns right there. So those two pawns will be endgame liabilities in many situations. So yeah, she trades and then brings the rook to e1, reinforcing the e3 square. So now players end up in a sequence of trades, trade of bishops, trade of rooks, and this is the structure we end up with in the center. And Firouzja immediately goes after attacking the weak e3 pawn because it's a backward pawn and it's the square in front is blockaded. So Wenjun defends the pawn with the rook, and f5 is a wonderful move because it literally takes control of the square in front of it and it will help in pressuring the pawn. But the downside of this move is the e5 square will be a good outpost for the knight if it is able to land there, but there is a bishop which is right now controlling the airport for that knight to land on this square, the e5 square. So Zhou and Jun tries poking in the queen side by playing queen a6, hitting the weaknesses. f4 is a wonderful counter shot because you cannot capture. The rook hangs on e1 because it's right now pinned this pawn and the rook is undefended. So she retreats back and the pawn is captured. Zhou Wenjun plays the move queen to d3. Now with this move, there's a double attack over there, and this knight cannot be captured because the rook takes the queen. It's very easy to see. Pawn to e2 is a mistake because this pawn is going to be lost anyway. So maybe Firouzja could have gone queen b8, hitting the queen side during that time while white spends his valuable time capturing the pawn on e3 with the queen or with the rook. So that would have been better, but Firouzja plays the move e2, and now Engine thinks white is winning, and Stockfish gives this move pawn to g4, forcing the bishop back to g6, and after queen takes e2, let's say after queen takes e2, rook takes e2. This endgame is winning for white because I mean, there are a lot of weaknesses on the queen side, and now this knight can easily land there and keep pressuring the queen side. But g4, sorry, that's g5. g4 looks pretty much weakening in some cases because you don't know what's the evaluation of the position and there is no stockfish to help you. So Ju and Jun plays the move knight f3, which is also a good move. This is interposing defense. So this knight blocks the vision of the bishop of the e2 pawn, and now rook takes e2 is enabled, and that pawn will fall eventually. So queen f7 is played, but the drawback of this move is now before winning this pawn, this knight to g5 attacks the queen, and it also threatens checkmate on h7. Not checkmate, but it would be a checkmating attack. Sorry about that. So if there was a rook on f8, then it would be a mate. But yeah, that would be devastating if the queen lands there because then the queen goes to h8, then the queen has to walk, and there are a lot of complications. And there are no other options but for Firouz trade queens. I think Firouzja missed this move. So yeah, white trades queens, black recaptures, and they reach this position. And rook takes e2 is finally played. Okay, the material is equal, but the pawn structure is bad for black, and there are doubled isolated pawns, so they are weaknesses. So these weaknesses are more visible in the endgame because the player with the weaknesses cannot defend those weaknesses efficiently because there are less pieces of board. So the weaknesses become more dominant. So that's the idea of the weaknesses in endgames. So yeah, so Firuzja tries to kick away the knight drops back. Bishop to e4 is played, centralizing the bishop. Knight to e5. So the knight lands on the outpost, and there is nothing in the black pieces to kick this knight off from the e5 square. Pressuring c6, and after a5, the pawn is lost as promised. So now Firuzja is down a pawn, and white is better, and white is probably winning this endgame. Let's see. Pawn to a4, rook to e3, rook to a6, hitting the knight. Knight drops back, attacking the rook. The rook cannot go back to b6 and keep on hitting because there is a pawn covering that. So the rook goes to g6, and there is a double attack on the pawn on g2. So it's easy to miss if one is careless. So the pawn on g2 could be defended with the rook, but that makes the rook passive. So g3 is played because that gets the pawn off of the light square, and there are no targets for the bishop right now. And that's the strategy. When you are playing against a bishop and you are having a knight, it's better to put all your pawns in the color of the square that is opposite to your opponent's bishop in the end game. Because when you let's say this is a light squared bishop, because bishop controls all the light squares, you put all your pawns on dark squares, okay, then this bishop cannot see anything. Literally, that's just a sitting duck. So that's the strategical concept behind putting these pawns on the dark squares. So this move achieves both of the concepts in one. H5 is played. Rook A3 is an inaccuracy. Actually, it would be better to play H4 and stop this flank pawn advance immediately. But Rook A3 is played. King F8 is played. King F2. Both the pairs are bringing their kings. Rook F6 check. King moves. And Rook G6 puts pressure on the pawn on g3 because that disables rook takes a4 because there is rook takes g3 with an attack on the h3 pawn also. So after rook g6, white plays the move h4, waiting. Sorry about that. A king to e8 and a rook to e3. Now white has a potential to trade that pawn for one of these pawns and have a pawn on the queen side. So the queen side play will be closed for a moment, and white can focus on the king side by playing knight a2 after playing a2 and knight c3 and bishop on e4, which will eventually win a pawn if black is not defending that. So black will be forced to defend that and get into a passive position. So in this, king d7 is played by black and a3 is played as promised. Rook to e6, prophylaxis, defending the bishop on e4, and king to d2 is a mistake because knight a2 in this position would be better to go knight c3 and put pressure on the bishop on e4. So that will force black's hands to remain tight down here or move the bishop which will lead to a rook trade, and that endgame will be completely winning for white because once the rooks are traded, it's a knight versus bishop situation, and white is up a pawn, so it will be winning easily. And white also has a lot of space on the queen side, and yeah, so knight a2 would have been better, but Ju and Jun goes for king d2. Rook f6 is a wonderful move, trying to infiltrate with the rook. So king e2 has to be played, and rook f8 is also a great move because you cannot just easily go after this plan of knight a2 knight c3 now, because the moment you go knight a2, there is rook b8 hitting the pawn on b2. So that makes things uncomfortable. So b3 is played, trying to trade off this pawn for the a4 pawn. So the trade happens, and bishop g2 is a mistake because rook a8 in this position would have been better, because this puts pressure on the a3 pawn, and this rook has to remain on the third rank defending this pawn, and you cannot push a4 easily because this rook prevents the advancement of this flank pawn. And this idea of knight a2 knight c3 is no longer available now because the potency of that idea is less. So bishop g2 is played instead, and now rook e3, centralizing the rook. Bishop goes back, and now she finally goes for this knight a2 idea, and this is better because the rook is not on a8. So the rook goes to b8. Now there is knight c3, allowing this rook b2 check, which will force the king to the back rank. Yeah, but white is better. So Ju and Jun correctly evaluates the position, and after rook b3 trying to paralyze, but there is king f2 and there is no rook b2 anymore because there is rook e2. This offers a trade of rooks, and you cannot trade rooks because this endgame will be winning. Oh, it's not black's move, and once, let's say, bishop goes back to g6 maybe, there is knight takes d5 because you cannot afford this trade, and if you move the bishop, then the pawn hangs, and white will be up 2 pawns, and let's say you go maybe king to e6, then this endgame is completely winning because there is a guy sitting on a3, and who's stopping that pawn? So that is not possible. So bishop to h1 is played, which is good. Knight back to d1, offering a trade of rooks, and Firouzja correctly declines the trade and moves the rook back to b8. And in this position, Wenjun calculates 13 moves ahead into the future and finds the position as winning for her, except for a move. That is, there are two moves. There is also this knight c3 idea in this position, but keeping that aside, two moves share a similar idea, but there is a slight variation in that. So pay attention. And beginner players, if you're watching, forgive me. Chess is complex sometimes, so I will do my best to explain that. There are two moves. One is rook e1, the other one is rook e5. Okay, what's the big deal? Rook e1 attacks the bishop, and rook e5 attacks these two pawns, right? But that is not actually an attack, that's a pressure. But this is an attack on the h5 pawn. Okay, which is winning? Rook e5 is winning. Rook e1 is okay, but it's not winning. It leads to a draw. Let me show you why. Let's say you play the rook e1. There is bishop e4, knight c3. Idea of knight c3 is to win a pawn. Okay, because after knight takes e3, d takes e4, there is rook takes e4, winning a pawn, and that rook in game will be completely winning because black will only be having these three pawns and white will be having 5 pawns, up 2 pawns. So that's the idea behind this move. So black will give this check, you go back, this will attack the knight. So maybe you trade, and after this you pay the move king g2, defending this g3 pawn, and after rook takes a3, there is rook takes e4, and rook back uh, to d3, putting pressure on this pawn. It's better to put your rook behind your opponent's pawn so that it just restricts the movement of the pawn, and that also makes this rook passive, trying to defend that pawn. And there is king f2, pawn to c6, king g2, pawn to g6, and king f2. And black has no moves. Black cannot get the king and go to the other side of the board because the rook is doing a good job cutting off the king. And black's rook is also cutting white's king off in the third rank, because if the king is able to enter the third rank, then the king will easily go there and gobble up all these pawns on the king side. So this rook restricts that, so the rook goes to a3. So that's one of the moves that black can play. There is rook to e5 now. Then there is rook back to d3. The idea of this rook e5 move is to go rook g5 and win the pawn on g6. So let's say black takes, you take, and there is rook to d5, hitting the pawn on c5. So you have to go rook back to g5. And after this trade, you may say, okay, I am up a pawn in a king and pawn endgame. Black has only 2 pawns, white has 3 pawns. So it must be winning, right? But no, black's king is on time, and white's king is placed on this move, placed on the square f2 in this particular variation. So it takes 1, 2, and 3, 4 moves to reach the pawn, which is too slow. By the time, black will easily gobble up the pawn on g5. Okay, so this is a draw. But in this position, rook e5 is winning because I will show you why. Rook e5 forces black to waste a tempo, okay, to defend this pawn on h5, and then you go back rook e1. Then there is bishop to e4, knight to c3, rook f8 check, king back to g1, rook to f3. There is takes. King g2 is critical, defending the pawn. And after rook takes a3, rook takes e4, rook to d3, king f2, okay, king f2, c6, king g2, and now black has no moves, no pawn moves, and no king moves. King can go back, but that's terrible. So now black plays the move rook to a3, and there is rook e5, okay, rook d3 going after the pawn on d4, rook g5, the same idea. Rook takes d4, rook takes g6, rook to d5, and after rook to g5, offering a trade of rooks, and this trade, this is winning. This king and pawn endgame is winning because our king is closer to the flank pawn on h5, and after king to e6, king to h3, and this is winning. Let's say black goes, let's say king f5, let's say that is king h4. And what will black do? Black has to do something. If he goes there, he loses this. So let's say black goes to g6. That is g4, takes, and this is winning. You have to go somewhere behind. Let's say you go king h7, that's king f5, and you know how to win this, right? So yeah, that is the difference in this position. Yeah, after all all that. Yeah. So that is the nuance between playing rook e1 immediately and playing rook e5 first, hitting the pawn, forcing g6, and going back to e1 and playing all that bishop e4, knight c3, and that shows the power of calculation and the complexity of chess. We may be this happens to our games also, right? We may think we are winning the game and we played something and the game ends draw, and we think, okay, we messed up somewhere, but we don't know where we made a mistake. And this is it. Stockfish is there to show all of us to us. And that's wonderful that she found all these sequence. So Juvenjun plays this rook e5, forcing g6, rook back to e1, bishop to e4, knight c3, rook f8, rook f3, takes, king g2, takes, takes, and in this position you go king f2, c6, king g2, and seeing all that, Firouzja didn't go for rook to a3. Instead, Firouzja plays the move rook to d1, allowing the king to enter the third rank. King f3 is played, rook f1 check, king to e1, rook to f7. This offers a trade of rooks, so Firouzja cannot trade rooks because that will lead to a losing king and pawn endgame, as I explained before. King to d3, and this rook enters the back rank, and this rook will be a monster rook soon. A rook to a7, and this is very classical because you could have immediately gone maybe rook d8, and after rook a3 there is king e4 now, and after rook takes g3 there is rook d6 check, king e7, and then you win this pawn, and this is completely winning. But she plays it clean. This shows her class. After rook e7 she immediately plays king e4, getting rid of any checks and slowly going after that. So rook a1 is played, rook d8, and in this position, Alireza Firouzja resigned the game and Ju Wenjun won the game. So Ju Wenjun is a women's world chess champion, beating a 2760 player, Alireza Firouzja, who was a former 2800 rated player. Right now, he lost around 40 points, but yeah, it's a 200-point deficit, but still manages to win the game, out calculating Firouzja in that 13 move sequence, which is excellent. And congratulations to Ju Wenjun. And if you enjoyed the video, thanks for watching. Consider subscribing to the channel, like the video, and share it to a friend. Bye bye.